Okay, so our final session for today is going to be the report outs from the breakout rooms. We'll go through these in order. I've asked each of the breakout moderators or their proxy to give a pretty short, approximately 3-minute report out, just of highlights of what they've found. And I think I'd like to do that so it gives us the opportunity to have a broader discussion here. So please listen and place any questions you might have or comments you might have in the Slido for us to, or raise your hand if you'd like to talk directly about the outputs of each of these groups. So we're going to start with session 1, data security and access. Bob, would you like me to share our report out slide, or do you have a different approach you'd like to use?
I think
the scribes will be sharing their screens directly. So Maria Fay.
Great, thank you.
Maria, thank you. We had a very active breakout group. We discussed a number of issues, which will be summarized in the document. Some of the challenges we identified was the complexity of sharing omics, Alzheimer related data among 2 or more repositories because of the complexity of consent groups and associated restrictions, linking data across 2 or more repositories, privacy concerns around facial images, and the perennial problem of the effort required to harmonize data from 2 or more platforms. The group discussed some practical steps that could take that might simplify some of these things. So, for example, creating a process that combines expertise from 2 or more DACs to simplify approvals when multiple DACs are required to sort of work out some of the complexity of omics data sharing restrictions when data is brought together from 2 or more groups. Another, it's always a problem to get to data, but setting up a standard process for approving groups of researchers to access data from 2 or more repositories, so a research group with one application can more easily access data from multiple repositories. Techniques for refacing images for certain applications, encouraging NIH to take a role in creating open source technology for privacy preserving record linkage, using API-based services for linking data across 2 or more platforms. And then we didn't really get time to discuss this. We talked about the ability of machine learning and AI to improve data harmonization between 2 or more platforms as an emerging opportunity, as well as federated machine learning from 2 or more platforms at the very end when some of the people had gone. Our group was very energetic, and if we had more than 3 minutes, I'm sure we could solve all the problems, but we're just going to stop talking right here. Some of these problems have been around for a while.
Thanks so much, Bob. Did your group consider or discuss, and if not, what are your thoughts about the complexities to this question posed by the diversity in architectures across the various platforms? We had a long conversation yesterday about centralized versus federated, and how do you think about that in how you address these?
I think the context for a lot of this is the beginning of standards emerging, API-based. I think the context which we should have said this is, moving to standard APIs, moving to fair APIs that expose data and have an increasingly good services that sort of span multiple platforms. That was the context. A lot of these are, are more policy or other kinds of issues that we try to come up with some pretty practical, simple steps that could be taken. We stayed away from some of the architecture issues that appeared in yesterday's session.
Great, thank you. Any other questions or comments for group one from the audience? All right, let's move on to group two. So group two is data linkage and harmonization.
Can you see the slide presentation?
Yes, we can see your whole.
No, I don't want to show my whole screen, so stop sharing. My apologies. Let me do a quick, I thought I was sharing only the PowerPoint. Okay.
There you go.
Thank you so much. So I first want to say that we had a fantastic group. They had super discussions, and I thank all of them. I'm just, presenting it, and thank my scribe for taking notes. Here are the outcomes. So we said, are there critical tools needed to be developed? And the questions that we posed was what metadata is essential for harmonization. We talked about different omics, different data types, omics data, imaging data, electrophysiology, for example. So the solutions that people came up with was define basic standards that can help with metadata definitions. Develop common metadata models, and this is involving domain experts like those who maintain these data resources. We don't appear to have at the moment a common metadata model that will help integrating or harmonizing data. Use graph models to harmonize data. This was discussed in multiple contexts to bring knowledge graphs and graphs to harmonize data. Anticipate integrating future data types, example, EHR, linkage, social determinants, etc. Especially it's more complicated to do social determinants. And then the outcome, maybe it is better to use something like stat learning or machine learning to bring social determinants into picture. So this was a recommendation for the first point. The second point was, does the emergence of AI present opportunities for harmonization linkages? Our questions that we started thinking about was data readiness for AI, feature and dimension reduction and evaluation, constraining AI through domain knowledge, and think of using graph network for learning contextual opportunities. So the recommendations that came out with at this point were need use cases and formatting, workflows, QCs, harmonizing data models pose challenges. Example, we thought of specific examples like cross-map data. Can we classify the cohort, develop models based on important features? Can AI help with this? Need protocol-based harmonization prior to AI, even before we get to AI. Create AI-ready models. Need to make harmonized data workflows and models, a repeat of what we said in the first point. Use of neuroimage data for staging patients. Example, imaging is the best example for exploring AI. So the question that came up was, can we use imaging data to, use AI and ML to look at, for example, stage-specific understanding, progression of AD, etc. Somebody pointed out that spare AD for MR data is an example for use. Use of graph neural networks. Example, MIDRC.org was brought up as an example. We need to feed harmonized data and AI model back to the source so that they can validate and verify it. The use case examples were two examples. Identify sex differences. The first point that was brought up was how to link data from the same individual across platforms. Context in viewing metadata and data linkage and harmonization through the lens of sex. Can we view the metadata through the lens of sex? Coding data through sex. C, can we use, for example, all of us tools and modify it and adapt it in aging NIA related studies to code, sex-based data distinctions. Gender differences are confounded with social determinants. How can we resolve this? Suppose there's a big challenge. Important how data is harmonized, specifically with reference to sex. For example, we need the documentation and workflows for harmonization. Specific questions that came up is bias in human clinical studies, including postmortem brains, FAD versus SAD brain data. Scoring, is the scoring the same for men and women, male and female, I'm sorry. Cognitive measures, same for male and female. Cohort selection tools, same as male and female. Second example of use cases was understand molecular processes. What are the challenges? ADRD is largely human specific and model systems be integrated. Example, senescence data. Primate models were brought as good examples. What data sources exist that relate AD and ADRD? Healthy versus pathological aging, and how do we integrate cohorts? This was really posed as a challenge that needs to be addressed. Use of EHR data for healthy versus pathological aging studies, especially with longitudinal studies. Are there data sources, resources for longitudinal studies in ADRD healthy cohorts? Some were mentioned, but it will be worthwhile having more clear mention of longitudinal studies. Collecting cognitive measures, example, Framingham has a connection with NIA for cognitive measures. Are there better ways to expose cohorts with longitudinal measurements? How do we harmonize these data? What are good model systems? How can they be harmonized? Non-human primate models should be brought into picture. Interoperability, the need for standards, structured vocabularies, and dynamic knowledge graphs, which will help in terms of linking longitudinal studies as well. Setting up collaborative agreements is a policy level question. NIA staff and NHLBI staff are present. They said that it will be important to have NIH think about collaborative agreements, especially, for example, with all of us. Can there be cognitive measurements associated with all of us cohorts that can be shared by NIA? Is it worth exploring collaboration with all of us to measure longitudinal imaging, family history, dementia, etc.? And then explore Medicare data associated with aging. Apparently, there are efforts in Medicare. NIA has an active program on this. Also, National Death Index data from CDC. CDC is a gateway for this, can be integrated. So these were recommendations that were made based on the use case recommendations. So this is our summary of where we were. I hope I didn't miss out. And our scribe has taken extensive notes, and he will also present the video. Thank you for allowing me to present this.
Thanks so much. Be interested in any comments from the field. I was wondering if there's any discussion about the complexity in selecting common metadata models or standards in a way that both is adaptive to the individual needs of the communities, but then also anticipates the need of integrating across communities. There's always a push and pull there. Any thoughts about or discussion about that from the group?
Lara was present in our meeting, and we had only briefly alluded to this. There are definitely the need for standards was brought up. And we thought it will be best if there is a community that emerges, self-organizes around people who are already gathering large amounts of data, NIA-funded projects such as LONI, such as AMP-AD and others. If they get together in terms of defining standards and defining metadata models, which would help in terms of harmonizing data. This, Lara, correct me if I'm wrong, this I thought was the consensus that we came up with.
I was wandering around from each of the meetings, so I missed that particular part. So I appreciate you discussing it here.
And there are some questions on the chat site. Was there any discussion of shortcomings that AI harmonization would face? Yes, we had a discussion of shortcomings. Number one, people talked about the need for quality control, the need for standards, the need for pre-organizing, harmonizing data prior to use of any AI. This was emphasized in my very first point that I made based on feedback that I got from the group. And there's an absolute need for harmonizing the data prior to use of AI. AI can also help harmonize data, this was brought up, but it is not if you want to use it for understanding what is going on later, then this is very important for starting with harmonized data.
Great. Thank you so much. Appreciate it. All right, we'll move on to session 3, data ecosystem architectures.
Hello. Okay, so in this one, we really were looking at the use cases through the lens of the sort of architecture that enables those. And so one of the first things that we did in this breakout is we tried to take a step back, and we've seen so many awesome platforms described and infrastructure described in this 2-day session. We tried to take a step back and identify and kind of think through the various architectures that we saw, the sort of download only architecture, or the cloud workspace, or cloud workspace with limitations on data egress, and federated systems versus non-federated. What came out of that conversation was the realization that this is a multi-dimensional, space of classifying systems, right? There's different aspects, like whether it's federated or not. There's different aspects in terms of data egress and policies around data moving between systems, or algorithms moving between systems. So it's very multifaceted in order to quantify and characterize these platforms. And so with that kind of framing, initially, we looked into the major challenges with an architectural eye, looking for what idealized architecture could help answer these use cases. And really what came out of those is a lot of commonality between use case 1 and use case 2. We saw, the first issue that we flagged were issues about sort of policies of how to know what you can do with the data, how you can link the data. Another thing that really was a very interesting topic that we got into is, because of that diversity of infrastructure, of architectures, what we haven't heard talked about quite as much as describing data with things like ontologies is describing the architecture itself with ontologies. So what can you do across these systems? Another topic that came up was, how do you link and encapsulate that linking between records and systems? How do you move synthetic cohort definitions between systems? But the drumbeat really in these conversations about these use cases is the realization that regardless of the particular aspects of the architecture of a particular system, federation is a must. Like it's written on the wall here that ultimately these platforms, data is distributed across them, whether they're NIH or NIA platforms, or they're sort of international platforms, data is distributed. So our approaches to architecture need to take into account the federated nature. So that was kind of the exploration of the use cases. Again, a lot of commonality identified in the sort of architectural needs of both of those use cases. In terms of solutions, this is a huge space, right? So this is a very big, conversation space, and we could have gone down many different rabbit holes, but we kind of sampled the field a little bit to look at different solutions that we thought would be impactful in those use cases, which are very characteristic of the sort of work that researchers are doing. And one thing that came out, again, potential solutioning here is, because researchers will not only want to work with biomedical research data and clinical data, but they're interested in combining data from other data sets out there at the federal level or even international. So thinking about things like, how would you mix in EPA data with the biomedical research data? So one of the things that the group, really, I think was a great observation was, how can we borrow from other fields, things like the Library of Congress and their classification of data and ontologies? How can we borrow things like schemas.org, which is widely used in the IT field, to promote the sort of self-description of our system? So using off-the-shelf components that are used beyond just the biomedical research field. The other thing that, potential solutions here, again, really kind of leaning into that idea of, we describe our data with data models and ontologies. Shouldn't we be describing the architecture as well? How can we describe the architecture in a structured way so you understand what a particular system is capable of? That's something that I think was a really interesting idea that came out of this. We did end up discussing algorithm portability. This was part of our conversation in the sense of embracing this world where data is federated, the realization that whether you're running a harmonization workflow on particular data sets or a novel algorithm, we need to be able to move our algorithms around in this federated model. And I'd say the second to last item that we looked at is, looking for gaps in what APIs or standards are not quite there in the community yet. And one of them that came up was, we need to have better standards around how we encapsulate and describe cohorts that can be moved between systems in support of that privacy preserving record linking operations. And finally, there are many different architectures out there. There are many different systems. Thinking about how these systems evolve and are supported and sustained in the long run was something that, things like strides, for example, are a key part of that. So that was something that, the group came up with as well as needing long-term solutions for. Looking at the sort of emerging opportunities and kind of pivoting towards going from a deep dive into different architectural aspects to big picture, one of the things I thought was really quite lovely in this breakout session was the desire to let the interoperability be driven by researcher use cases and needs. There are so many different things that we can work on for interoperability, but being able to prioritize them around researcher objectives that are trying to work in this distributed fashion, these use cases that we heard, is a great way of prioritizing and taking, limited resources and being able to apply them to the interoperability components that give the best bang for the buck, so to speak. And the final thing that we talked about as a group that I think is really interesting and cool, and undoubtedly will have fascinating applications in our field, is looking at the rapidly evolving field of generative models, large language models. A lot of what we're talking about in terms of describing and comparing between data sets across federated systems involves a lot of painstaking and very involved curation. And so looking at ways in the future of potentially using these large language models, these generative models, for working on that cross-data annotation process, I think is a really interesting future direction that we can be looking at. So Laura, we covered a lot of ground in this meeting. It's a pretty deep topic, but hopefully that gives you guys an idea of what we talked through.
Yeah, that's wonderful. There's lots of great meaty ideas here. And there's a couple of themes here that really echo from what we heard yesterday. One is quite simply that each of these platforms is modular in nature, and some of their components are pretty well developed to meet a need, and others are completely experimental, and we're learning as we go within each of the platforms. So that we can reuse and reshare where useful and integrate where possible, but these things are growing and building as they go. And so there's this the second component is that of this prioritization process, right? You could build lots of things, you could interoperate infinitely, but how do we prioritize what we work on?
Absolutely. All right, thank you.
Thank you, Brian. All right, so we'll move on to the next session, promoting DEIA in data ecosystems.
Robson. So our group discussed, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
So our group discussed promoting DEIA in relation to the two use case that was provided in this workshop. We first identified some of the major challenges, and the participants were very lively and interactive. And some of the major challenges they have identified is lack of transparency in the data ecosystem. This is similar to what Mike presented yesterday, especially in relation to the diversity and representation of underserved community, even also gender, sexual minority group. So there was also a lack of good representation of data across racial ethnic groups, including not only the data, but also the research staff community of across the spectrum also needed. There is lack of data harmonization and standardization, especially in relation to the use case one, which is measurement of sexual and gender minority variables. Sometimes the sample size are small enough, incomplete, especially for intersex groups. This has been quite often known that they are very small in terms of prevalence, but they may not even captured in some of these data sets. And there is lack of diversity in researchers, both in discipline and diversity. Some of the potential solution is to promote diversity, inclusion, equity, inclusion, and accessibility within those data ecosystem. Is first of all to try, to build trust in relationship with the community, and and also make sure that there is a community-driven data collection, so that the data that we collect is more diverse, equitable, and inclusive. In relation to the use case one, developing ontology for sex variable that considers sex and gender are not synonymous, and that intersex people exist is very important. This is also could be applied similar to racial ethnic representation as well. Use of NIH common data elements for sex, gender, racial, ethnic groups, very important. Some of the resources that are available, like the Phoenix toolbox, data common elements is one of them. And one of the things that was discussed is that, especially in relation to the earlier this morning presentation, where there is a rubric scoring for FAIR, for the data ecosystem, similar tools or metrics should be also, developed for DEIA as well. And that way that we can intentionally promote diversity, equity, and inclusion within the NIA data ecosystem, or also in general within the NIH data ecosystem. And another issue related to promoting diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility is that we need to collect more information, especially more lived experience data, such as S2H, should be captured, but also linked to the data ecosystem, either also through electronic health record as well. Data harmonization and linkage across data ecosystem is very important for underserved communities, especially while preserving the privacy and the confidentiality of those records through PPR ARL. Emerging opportunities, we said in order to increase the transparency, especially, but also to engage the community underserved to participate in biomedical research study, but also to be participant and provide their data. Interactive visualization is very important. This has been presented earlier. Mike Griswold has presented. And this is something that an emerging potential solution for all the data ecosystem, that to have a dashboard of visualization of the representation of the different racial, ethnic, and sex and gender minority, and especially with augmented reality as well. There was discussion between federated learning and versus centralized data, and the federated data learning maintains is more appealing to the underserved community because it maintains privacy and ownership, while they are also included in the research study. At the end, we have also explored how large language models like ChatGPT can promote the diversity, inclusion, and accessibility, especially in facilitating linkage of data from underserved community, but also extracting unstructured data sets such as S2H and linking them with those data ecosystem. With that, that's the summary of our group.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I wonder if you're the group considered the complexity in community governance of data as we start to think about linking data across platforms and communities.
So I think we have touched those, and we think that our group thinks that, especially also in my opinion as well, that we're making more advances in terms of the technology. The technology is there, and the issue in the difficulties in terms of the data governance and policies, and those are the most challenging. And there are no really clear-cut solution for this, and you have to engage community by community and come out with ways of data use agreements, data governance, and also, especially as you have heard frequently from Spiro, in relation to the tribal nations, there is difference in terms of culture, in terms of process and decision-making that needs to be taken into account in order for those communities to participate and be part of that research study. So I think what we are lacking is that in terms of the data governance and data use agreement and sharing models, those are the ones that are, especially the templates that acceptable by both the community and the researchers. Those are the missing components and difficult to tackle.
Thank you. All right, we'll turn it over to our last breakout session, data analysis within data ecosystems.
Excellent. Hi, we had a I think a good focused discussion. And there's sort of a laundry list here, but I think in order to get through them in 3 minutes, I'll go relatively quickly. I think one of the first comments that came up, I think is really important as we think about data analysis, is that a lot of the requirements that we need and a lot of the challenges that we face around doing analysis on multimodal data or integrated data are not technical. It starts when the data is collected. There's challenges around sample bias. There's challenges around, different data coming from different individuals. Even if we link them, we may not have enough population, and study design is really, really important. There are also things that are required in terms of really, when you do the analysis, understanding the provenance of that data and where and what essentially the history of the lifespan of that data is. And as we think about this individual use case, things that other groups were discussing as well were hard for us not to want to discuss too, because it's so important when you think about how analysis will be done in the future. Data quality is really important. Is sex even listed as a variable? Is it standardized? How do we incorporate gender? There were lots of discussions too about when we didn't talk specifically about federated or centralized models, but we sort of assume that they exist and that governance and policy issues are a big deal. How do we share data and integrate data into a single place? We have technologies such as using Docker containers to move, say, machine learning models or data science around onto data, but even still, those models will have to touch data from potentially federated resources. And how do we make that easier? How do we harmonize DUAs and data sharing? How do we harmonize consent to ensure that all the different types of data could be used? And then how do we, better get ahead of the fact that different institutions, whether they be healthcare, universities, other research organizations, how do we overcome differences around how they share data and what their policies are? There were potential solutions. We thought about potential solutions to these goals. We talked about, using containerized model to data sort of approaches. We felt that having, good, robust, searchable metadata. Another area that I think is really important for us to think about as a community, this came up yesterday, is being more user-friendly and having training materials and communication materials and being better able to improve the fluency of the technologies and the platforms that we put in place so investigators know how to navigate what it is that we're building. And I think that's really, really an important point, because the investigators really will be the consumers of doing the analysis to generate the awesome research in the future. We talked about some exotic things like improving data dictionaries by releasing, say, synthetic data across different data resources so that we wouldn't have to have governance on that data perhaps at all. I think that repeats ourselves. And then there are lots of emerging opportunities. We heard about lots of them yesterday. The collaboration across the cloud platforms, really great presentations yesterday about how we're going to bring resources together. Things like NAC is building a data front door to be able to search across and build repositories across resources. I think there's a lot that we can leverage from the open data science community. Data challenges, standardized repositories, standardized metadata, the ability to move models around, cloud-based sandboxes, like all those things that the open data science community is doing, open biomedical ontologies, we should jump on. And then I think we talked about a lot of things that that other groups did. Next slide. I'm already at 4 minutes, so I'm going to just like summarize this really quickly because I'm at the end. So use case number 2, the major challenges, all the challenges from the previous slide sort of apply. And, you know, and I think we talked a lot about this question is really hard because it requires reaching outside of the ADRD research community potentially, and have a better understanding of aging and healthy aging. And I think that that there is, you know, none of the individual resources that we're building will really be able to answer this question. And so we have to integrate, and there's opportunities for looking at existing healthy aging studies in humans, as well as even model organisms and data that's been done there. We know a lot about aging, but we don't know, but there's still a lot that we don't know. And I think that's an area of, you know, in areas that we may be able to put in as solutions. And we'll have to enroll new subjects and track them and be very forward thinking. Emerging opportunities, large biobanking, linking real world data, you know, the PPRL kind of linkage and GUIDs that we talked about, you know, data-driven approaches to inclusive recruitment. You could think of tiered ways of addressing this for analysis, like having like real world data with huge populations and then doing innovative clinical trials that are much deeper and more expensive on smaller populations. And taking a data-driven approach to define those smaller populations is really an intriguing idea. And I think I mentioned some of these others. Next slide. Okay, and then just finally, on the 2 questions, like, you know, doing cross-platform science is not easy. And we need better funding. We need, you know, funding in kind of targeted to enable these cross multimodal analyses. I think that the NIH data science policy and strategy is going to be very helpful. We're going to have data sharing agreements, you know, data sharing plans going in with all the proposals, and I think that's going to stimulate data sharing in really good ways. And you know, incentivizing data harmonization, I don't have a good solution to that, but I think that's something that needs to, you know, we need to think about. And again, we mentioned training and better fluency of data resources, you know, and really highlight investigators' initiatives that do this well, maybe outside of the AD research space. And then finally, are there particular kinds of science that are amenable to this kind of analysis? We discussed this. I really think that the kind of projects that are amenable to the kinds of research that we do are maybe not what we want to go after. Like we want to, the things that we're talking about here, at least in our conversation, were hard problems about that are not necessarily amenable, but problems that we should go after to try to solve. And you know, these multimodal from federated resources. So I'll stop.
Well, that was wonderful. Lots of potential solutions. And I can hear your enthusiasm and the enthusiasm of the group coming through. Back to the earlier point of this also being a prioritization problem, where would you get started?
You're asking me specifically in terms of analysis? I think, whoa, so where would we start? I can think of 2 kind of, this is totally off the cuff. I can think of 2 kind of approaches that we could take. One is, you know, we could look at governance and how we share data across the resources and what data that we have. And, you know, what are the kinds of questions, kind of advancing the conversation that we've already been having here. You could also imagine maybe a broader approach that might be more strategic, that actually could, you know, instead of doing a deep dive to solve any particular problem, you could imagine having small kind of focused groups that would get together to kind of talk about these individuals, maybe continuing the conversations that we just had, you know, task forces, or I don't know, whatever kind of strategic planning to kind of think about, you know, to think about some of the some of these issues individually, the data governance issue, about federated data, the study design issues about even if we federate, it's going to be hard to do, maybe to do good studies, and we're going to have to be very forward thinking in terms of what we do. And then there's, good technology discussions too. I think data sandboxing enclaves or model to data approaches with like virtualized Docker containers or something like that are very Wild Westy right now across all the consortia that I work with outside of in other NIH institutes. And it'd be awesome to see a little bit more harmonization in that space, because I think some groups could use the guidance.
Thank you. There's a question in the comments, in the chat, sorry. So your point on issues starting at the point of measurements is definitely valid. However, in integrated data analyses, you have horizontal analyses in the same data modality where your measurement harmonization point is important, and then you have vertical analyses across multiple data modalities. There are no clear solutions, and not clear if just feeding an AI architecture with diverse data is meaningful. Did the breakout team discuss this point?
I think that's partially what we were getting at. I'm not totally sure, and others who are in the group can also chime into this, but I think I think that I think what I'm getting at is it's that some of this is, a lot of this is not technical. It's like, doing good science requires good data that goes into it that's well planned. And I think that is going to make it difficult to, that it's good as the world advances, science advances, it becomes, we start to think about doing things differently. That's in terms of how we design studies evolves. And so that just makes it challenging when we think about doing big data, cross federated sites, an AI-like analysis that could be, across a single modality or across many different modalities.
Thank you. Thanks, Sean. All right. So I'm going to turn it over to Stan, who is going to summarize for us.
And I shall share my screen here as soon as I can. Please bear with me for a moment. So I'm assuming you can see this. I see a nodded head.
Yes.
So I am going to attempt to take you through a chronological summary of today, which will culminate in Laura's excellent 5 takeaway points. And I did this on the fly during the day, so please forgive me if I have done it poorly, which I'm sure is the case in many examples, or if I somehow slighted anybody. That was not ever my intent. So I will proceed. So this morning we heard a discussion from a number of different groups and their repositories that are growing. And the thing that I took away from that is that their AD and ADRD research is amassing its own massive troves of scientific data. And I was frankly surprised and not surprised. I mean, not surprised because of course there's a thriving area of research, and it's an area of research that's essential. And so it's not a surprise, but I was surprised at how many collections have been amassed that I was totally unaware of. And I'm impressed, and I was stunned by the diversity of solutions and how that might fit in with the rest of the NIH institutes that aren't looking at this particular disease process. The AD knowledge portal had an excellent outcome from its FAIR assessment. Secondary data use showing that 56% of the publications were derived from secondary use. That is an impressive, very impressive indicator that we need to make sure we talk about everywhere we go. The NAC is a very large, comprehensive cloud-based system. It does things that I haven't seen done in other groups. In many cases, they set standards. So there's a high degree of consistency. And The fact that they include model organisms, which is not entirely unique, but it's certainly an area where they focus. Again, an incredible opportunity. NIA GADS is mature. It has a beautifully accessible interface written through APIs, and I was impressed with the thoughtfulness that went into that particular repository. Lonnie has a lot of different data types, and they've really spent time thinking about how to find cohorts and construct those cohorts across many projects. And they emphasize this was not the first time, but one of the times that people spent a fair amount of time on the GUIDS opportunity, which will come up again in the rest of the summer. And then CARD is another data generator that's using other platforms for cloud centralized community science. And so my takeaway from the morning sessions is that we're doing quite well in general on fairness, but now we have to go down to a more granular level and look at the fairness in that aspect as well. And the next steps could be that we talk about some core sets of governance, guardrails, and standards around how we might want to do things as a collective rather than each of these platforms, each of these little ecosystems doing things in their own way. Maybe we can come together in a larger discussion and find ways of setting up governance principles. And I call them guardrails because I think they are, ways of simply constraining the flexibility we have, and also start to set some standards about how we do something. Now, again, I'll come back to that in a minute. We just heard the breakout report, so I'm just going to give you a kind of a rehash of that. Security and access, the emphasis was on the fact that NIA has extra complexity in sharing. And so those processes might be addressed by looking across DACs, which is a good idea for other groups to start thinking about. The linkage across repositories, which is not very easily done. So this is an opportunity in that space. The linkage and harmonization group had a bunch of interesting ideas. Metadata by protocol. We could find a way of creating metadata by some process, and that might hopefully lead us to a greater degree of harmonization that's built into the fact that we all follow the same process. They mentioned data readiness, also mentioned knowledge graphs. They did an interesting thing to point out that use case 1 is a use case that has biases in many places throughout the processes, including the collection of the data and the way you think about collecting the data from the very onset up to when you think about how to analyze the data downstream. So that was interesting. The gender bias is a ubiquitous bias. And then use case 2, they seem to argue with, and I think it's exactly true, that model organisms present an opportunity in this space. They reference a possible CDC role. That's interesting. And also that they'd like to see standards that may be emerging organically because they could be things that we talk about as a community. So architectures, there's all kinds of policies, issues that we have to address, particularly as we try to strive toward interoperability. There's a diversity of architectures. That's good. That means we have some things to think about and look at and analyze and try to determine if we can take any take-home lessons out of this. Classifications of systems is an emerging need. We haven't really thought about that. How do we characterize a particular architecture? There's been papers written, some of which I've been involved in, to do a little bit of this, but I think there's some deeper scholastic, scholarly thinking that's necessary in this space to be able to talk about an architecture as being this kind of thing. Observation of data is going to be distributed no matter what, so we have to live with that, and that does kind of dictate some architectural decisions. We need to borrow more widely from other fields. Boy, that came up over and over again, and systems analysis is one of those places. We haven't really identified the clear gaps that we need to discover among all of the architectures where, maybe somebody's solving something that another group is not. And they brought up the AI and machine learning potential. Then shifting to DEIA in the ecosystems. Boy, I just drove home listening to just the summary. I wasn't in that session, that the transparency and representation and trust are all linked together problems. It's not a surprise at all, but it drove the point home. But that does mean that there's lots of innovation possible. And the idea of ontology for sex variables is fantastic. They also mentioned not just AI and ML, but federated learning, which is a very interesting idea because you could preserve the trust of different small communities that want to share their data, but they don't want to to share it in any specific person identifiable way. And the idea of learning on that and then sending back to a centralized learning model is very interesting. And we still have policy issues that persist. I'm sorry, spelling error there. Across, the issues of DEIA, as well as all of the other issues that we've brought forth. Finally, the data analysis within ecosystems. DEIA is multimodal, and that presents its own set of problems. And that also means that it's a requirement that we have collaborations in order to pursue many operations in this space. And it is a very rich space. It's a rich problem space. That's one that is must have additional resources devoted to this space, because we know it's a large scale societal problem. They mentioned the biobank and how getting samples is something that we don't need to be thinking about. Sometimes we think everything's digital, but it's not. And we have to remember that. And the idea of creating data-driven cohorts has appeared in lots of different platforms. And I'm seeing it more and more become a standard way of thinking. And also was struck by the fact that we basically are entering a data sharing era. It's an era that is somewhat new for us all, because we haven't been required to do this, and now we are going to be required to do it. And that's going to require us to endure change, and change is always hard, and we'll have to walk through that process. So looking across those 5 report backs, here's my summary, done very rapidly on the fly. Policy issues are everywhere. We see lots of opportunity in machine learning and data harmonization, which means that we're going to need to think about engineering prompts a lot. We're going to have to change some of our language and how we use some of these machines. More than one group has pointed out that knowledge graphs might help. And knowledge graphs are nice because they're explicit. They don't hide what they're doing in a collection of parameters. Instead, you have these triples that show how entity A and entity B are related. And it's not necessarily facts, but it's facts oriented, so that you have things that are very explicitly stated. So I also just want to call out all of us. Most days was frequently cited as an exemplar, and that's something that all of us team should be very proud of. I was struck by the diversity across a whole lot of dimensions. It's not just communities or race or ethnicity. It's also diversity across infrastructures and models and ontologies. And it's both good and it presents challenges, because we have a lot of stuff, a lot of technology, a lot of thinking, a lot of people skills that we need to mesh together in an elegant way. The idea that some modules are starting to mature across these platforms, that's a strategic opportunity, I would argue. Is there a way we can pick out, the 5 different APIs that are being broadly used and centralize the development and support of those, so that we all use the same basic set of procedures? So that's an interesting opportunity to talk about funding, because funding and prioritization will always interact. And this scientific infrastructure, probably this community needs to get together more often and have a meeting like this, which, by the way, has far exceeded my expectations. I had an innate belief that this was going to be a fun crowd to hang out with and talk with, but it's far exceeded my dreams. And I think that's further emphasized my need for additional education and training. I've written down a bunch of things that I want to go study, like systems analysis. We've talked about it now maybe 10 times, that GUIDs are an opportunity to try to figure out how to go about doing this in a very precise way. And like I said at the last of the prior slide, this is the era of data sharing. We better get serious about it. And it's going to persist for a long time, and it's going to have lots of pros and cons. And so my overall day recap, strengths across these collections are incredibly valuable. How valuable is an action item? So the thing in brackets here are action items that I think we need to take. We need to figure out the value of putting things together. And I don't know how to do that, but it's something we probably should do. The diversity of the models, how do we exploit the diversity? We need to have a discussion about that. So these are kind of me suggesting that NIH is opportunities for NIH to think about. Right now, I saw it multiple times. We're still using Google to find each other. We go and we do a search in Google in order to find portal X, portal Y, what data is available. I'm not sure I want Google to own the search space. So we need to figure out how we're going to do cross-system search at NIH. I just left NIH up there without relying on Google, because that's not a sufficient. I don't know how Google works. I have an idea, but it's a black box, and that worries me from a scientific standpoint. Knowledge graphs may be a big option here, and the NCATS data translator effort, which I've been part of, are not as active lately, but it's an opportunity for us to think about that, because that is being used in some places to look across systems. Large language models, we need an applicability assessment. You know, is this doable? Is it something that's going to help? And I've heard it come up at probably 6 meetings in the last month. So it's something we better do. And that probably means people who have time get together and find some funding. A huge amount of intellectual sharing has been generated by this cross-fertilization in these last 2 days. I am impressed, and more opportunities for sharing across our neighborhoods is welcomed. Take-home points. The NIH data ecosystem, and particularly the ADRD data ecosystem, supports data distribution across multiple research community and with dozens of platforms. So this is getting to be a numerically interesting problem. We have to build these things, and we have to share practices, and we better do that inclusively, transparently, with attention to diversity and culturally non-appropriated, in order to ensure we have the appropriate foundation to build our future scientific and medical recommendations. We have a responsibility here to patients ultimately. And we want to do this well and carefully, and be able to explain when we do make mistakes, why we made a mistake, and how we were intending to go in the right direction. The platforms are continuously working and evolving in parallel. So it's not like any one of these systems is static, and they're doing so to meet the evolving need of their communities. And that gives us an opportunity to promote the reuse of established components and find out where we could concentrate some active innovation on new components that are needed, missing, or inhomogeneous, and therefore giving us an opportunity to fix a few things. FAIR principles, the modular architectures, and the common standards for the content and the platform architecture is certainly necessary, and we've shown that it's largely being adhered to, but it's not sufficient for interoperability. And then finally, the engagement between platforms driven by serious scientific need has to be actively promoted. And that's going to require us to talk at levels of granularity to establish requirements to drive really useful solutions across NIH writ large. And with that, I am done, and I will